The South China Sea at 8:44 a.m. presented a specific visual fact that the bridge crew registered before any radar confirmation was required. The contact was visible to the naked eye at 6.2 nautical miles. In the South China Sea in early morning, with a light haze reducing the visual horizon to approximately 8 nautical miles, 6.2 miles was close enough to see hull and superstructure without binoculars. What the bridge crew saw was large. Not large in the way that a Karakurt corvette was large, or a Type 052D destroyer was large. The specific scale of 7,500 tons at sea distance, recognizable by profile and proportion to anyone who had studied the fleet intelligence briefs. What the bridge crew saw at 6.2 nautical miles was categorically different in scale. A different class of vessel. A vessel that, from this distance in this light, looked like something that was looking down. The Type 055 Renhai-class guided missile cruiser displaced 12,500 tons and measured 180 meters overall length. At 8:44 a.m., bearing 028, range 6.2 nautical miles, it was closing at 18 knots on a track that the CIC had been projecting for the past 11 minutes. Bridge CIC. Contact Kilo 1, bearing 028, range 6.2 nautical miles, speed 18 knots. Contact is a Type 055 Renhai-class cruiser, confirmed by hull silhouette and AIS cross-reference. Contact has been on this heading since 0833. CPA estimate 250 yards. Time to CPA 19 minutes. Contact displacement significantly exceeds hours. I want to flag that for the bridge team. The CIC watch officer had added that last sentence on his own initiative, and it was both professionally appropriate and operationally significant. In every prior gray zone standoff in the South China Sea encounter record, the U.S. destroyer had been the largest vessel in the immediate tactical picture, heavier than CCG cutters in the standard configuration, heavier than Type 052D destroyers, heavier than Karakurt corvettes, heavier than anything the maritime militia put in the water. The physical fact of displacement, 9,200 tons of U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class, was not merely a structural detail. It was the implicit context of every standoff. The destroyer was the anchor. The other vessels maneuvered around it. The geometry assumed that the U.S. vessel was the one that did not need to move. At 8:44 a.m., the geometry had a different physical context. The Renhai displaced 12,500 tons. The destroyer displaced 9,200 tons. The Renhai was 3,300 tons heavier, not marginally heavier, but in the range of 36% heavier. At 250 yards, the height differential between the Renhai's bridge and the destroyer's bridge would be approximately 4 to 6 meters. The Renhai's commanding officer would be looking down at the destroyer's bridge. The destroyer's bridge crew would be looking up at the Renhai. In every prior parallel encounter in the series, the Udaloy at 73 yards in the Baltic, the Haijing 5901 at the Scarborough Shoal, the relative size of the vessels had been either comparable or in the U.S. vessel's favor. The Udaloy was 7,900 tons, slightly lighter than the Arleigh Burke. The Haijing 5901 was heavier, but it was a Coast Guard vessel, not a warship. The Renhai was heavier, and it was the most capable surface combatant in the PLAN's inventory. The officer of the deck absorbed the CIC's flag note and pressed the intercom. At 8:46 a.m., the captain stepped onto the bridge. He looked at the contact picture for 15 seconds. The Renhai on radar at 5.9 nautical miles, closing at 18 knots. Then, through the bridge windows, where the contact was visible to the naked eye as a large gray shape against the South China Sea's blue-green water, its silhouette unmistakable to anyone who knew the Renhai's characteristic topside profile. The raised forward superstructure, the distinctive sensor mast configuration, the specific breadth of hull that 12,500 tons of displacement required. I have the con. The Renhai-class was the plan's answer to the U.S. Ticonderoga-class cruiser, designed for area air defense, anti-surface operations, and fleet command. The plan was sending its most capable surface combatant to conduct the same maneuver that smaller vessels had been conducting for years. The message was the mass. CPA to Kilo 1, 245 yards. Time 17 minutes. He turned to the CIC intercom. Get me the Renhai's weapon system status. Is anything active or in tracking mode? And I want the South China Sea Patrol picture. Are there any additional planned contacts in the area? The CIC report came in 60 seconds. The Renhai's own fire control radar was not active in tracking mode on the U.S. vessel. Its navigation radar was running. Its communication systems were active. No weapon systems in the operational posture, consistent with imminent employment. Additional contacts: 1. Type 054A frigate at 14 nautical miles northwest, holding. 1 CCG cutter at 8 nautical miles southwest, holding. The Renhai was the approach contact. The frigate and CCG cutter were observation and documentation assets. Standard 3 platform geometry. Renhai is the primary approach contact frigate and CCG as documentation and support. The difference was the Renhai. CPA to Kilo 1, 235 yards. Time 16 minutes. At 8:48 a.m., Channel 16 opened from Kilo 1, in Mandarin first, then English, with the measured cadence of a vessel that had delivered this broadcast in training. United States warship operating in Chinese sovereign waters of the South China Sea. This is a People's Liberation Army Navy vessel conducting lawful patrol operations. You are in Chinese territorial waters in the vicinity of the Nansha and Xisha island groups. Your current operation is in violation of Chinese maritime law. You are directed to depart these waters immediately. The People's Republic of China will take all necessary measures to protect its sovereign rights. All necessary measures. The broadcast used more emphatic language than the standard sovereignty claim. All necessary measures was a phrase that appeared in the Chinese government's formal diplomatic communications when it wanted to convey that it had not foreclosed any option. In the Renhai's mouth, on Channel 16, at 5.7 nautical miles in closing, it carried the specific weight of a phrase being delivered by 12,500 tons. The captain did not respond on Channel 16. CPA to Kilo 1, 225 yards. Time 15 minutes. He made his first decision. Fire control radar active on Kilo 1. Tracking mode, no illumination. At 5.7 nautical miles, the fire control radar's tracking solution on a 12,500-ton cruiser was precise and held with no difficulty. The Renhai's electronic warfare suite and the Renhai-class carried the most capable EW suite in the PLAN surface combatant inventory, would identify the emission type, the frequency band, the pulse repetition interval, and the specific tracking mode within approximately 15 seconds of activation. The message that fire control radar sent to the Renhai's bridge at 8:48 a.m. was the same message it sent everywhere. You are inside a tracking solution. But the message was being sent by a 9,200-ton Arleigh Burke to a 12,500-ton Renhai. The Renhai was tracking the destroyer. The destroyer was tracking the Renhai. Neither had weapons in active employment posture. Both had fire control data on the other. A tactical equivalence expressed in electromagnetic terms. At 8:50 a.m., the CIWS completed its power on and entered passive thermal tracking mode. The barrel oriented toward the Renhai. As the Renhai moved, the barrel moved. The barrel's orientation was visible from the Renhai's bridge. At 5.3 nautical miles, the Renhai's bridge crew would need binoculars to see the CIWS barrel's orientation specifically. At 4 nautical miles, they would not need binoculars. CPA to Kilo 1, 210 yards. Time, 13 minutes. At 8:51 a.m., the Seahawk received authorization to launch. Its role, altitude documentation at 400 feet. At 400 feet, the Seahawk's camera would have the full overhead picture of both vessels simultaneously. The Renhai's approach track, the U.S. destroyer's position, the CPA geometry, and the specific visual detail that made this encounter different from any prior encounter in the South China Sea Patrol record. The aerial perspective on the size differential between the two vessels. From 400 feet looking down, the camera would show 2 gray warships in the South China Sea. One of them was larger. The Seahawk launched at 8:51 a.m. and climbed to 400 feet. The first friction event arrived at 8:52 a.m. The Type 05-4A frigate, holding 14 nautical miles northwest, had been stationary since the CIWS first logged it at 0740. At 8:52 a.m., it began moving, not toward the destroyer's position, but on a track that would bring it to the destroyer's port beam approximately 8 to 10 nautical miles out in a flanking observation position. Not approaching. Repositioning for a better documentation angle. The frigate's movement confirmed that the three-platform operation was coordinated and that the Renhai was the primary contact in an operation that had a command structure behind it. The CIC tactical officer logged the frigate's movement and updated the contact picture. The captain noted it. CIC Bridge. 7th Fleet is receiving our real-time data feed? Yes, sir. The contact picture and fire control tracking status have been transmitting since 0840. 7th Fleet had the picture. Pacific Command had the picture. The State Department's Asia Bureau duty officer had the picture within the normal escalation timeline for a planned Renhai-class intercept of a U.S. Freedom of Navigation operation. CPA to Kilo 1, 195 yards. Time, 11 minutes. At 8:53 a.m., the second friction event arrived. The Seahawk pilot reported from 400 feet. Bridge, Seahawk. I have Kilo 1 on camera from altitude. I am confirming Type 055 configuration. I want to describe what I'm seeing from up here. The Renhai is substantially larger than your vessel from this angle. The size differential is visible and significant. The Renhai's topside equipment is in standard configuration. I'm not seeing anything in an unusual posture. I can see the bridge wing of the Renhai. There appear to be several crew members on the bridge wing with what looks like camera equipment. They are documenting the approach from their bridge wing. Camera equipment on the Renhai's bridge wing. The Chinese documentation effort was operating from the Renhai's own observation positions, recording the approach from the cruiser's perspective. The Renhai's records would show its own bridge wing camera documentation of a U.S. destroyer at CPA range. The Seahawk's records would show an aerial view of the full geometry, both vessels, relative position, relative size. 2 sets of documentation. 1 event. The captain noted the bridge wing camera crew and said nothing. The documentation on the Renhai's bridge wing was exactly what it appeared to be. The plans and counter record, being built in real time with the same commitment to documentation that the U.S. Navy applied to its own encounter records. Both sides were building the record. The records would differ in framing and emphasis. They would agree on the facts. A Renhai-class cruiser and a U.S. Arleigh Burke-class destroyer had been at 195 yards in the South China Sea. CPA to Kilo 1, 180 yards. Time, 10 minutes. At 8:54 a.m., the captain authorized Channel 16. Renhai-class cruiser Kilo 1. This is a United States warship conducting a lawful freedom of navigation operation in international waters of the South China Sea. Your current course places you on a direct intercept track with our position. We have fire control radar in tracking mode on your vessel and CIWS in passive tracking. This encounter is being documented by aerial surveillance and transmitted to U.S. 7th Fleet Command in real time. You are advised to maintain a safe passing distance. We are maintaining our course and speed. The broadcast was in English. It named the fire control tracking status, the CIWS passive tracking, the aerial surveillance, the 7th Fleet real-time feed. Everything in the encounter record that existed at 8:54 a.m. was named in the broadcast. The record of the record being built was itself put on the record. The Renhai did not respond on Channel 16. CPA to Kilo 1, 165 yards. Time, 8 minutes. The Seahawk pilot's second report. Bridge, Seahawk. I have both vessels in frame simultaneously. The Renhai is at 3.1 nautical miles from your position. The size differential is very visible from this altitude. The Renhai's superstructure extends approximately 4 to 5 meters above your bridge level from my vantage point. I can see the Renhai's CIWS mount. It does not appear to be tracking your position. I can still see the bridge wing documentation crew. They are filming. I am recording continuously. The Renhai's CIWS was not tracking the U.S. destroyer. The U.S. CIWS was tracking the Renhai. The asymmetry was specific, The U.S. destroyer was tracking the Renhai with fire control and CIWS. The Renhai was approaching without its own weapon systems in tracking mode. That asymmetry was in both documentation records. CPA to Kilo 1, 150 yards. Time, 7 minutes. The captain stood at the center bridge window. He had been at the center window since taking the con at 8:46 a.m. He was watching the Renhai through the forward bridge windows, not yet at binocular range, but close enough to see the detail of its hull and the specific topside configuration that the intelligence briefs had described. The vessel was large. It was close. It was on a track that in 7 minutes would bring it to within 150 yards of the bridge he was standing on. The weight of 12,500 tons at 150 yards was a physical reality. The Renhai was not going to physically endanger the destroyer by passing at 150 yards in a calm South China Sea. 150 yards was not 60 yards, and the Renhai was not running at 28 knots like the Udaloy in the Baltic Wake encounter. It was at 18 knots on a steady track. The CPA was 150 yards of separation in calm water. Physically, it was manageable. The psychological message was what the plan had designed. The mass was the message. The size was the statement. 12,500 tons passing at 150 yards said something that 7,900 tons or 7,500 tons could not say. It said, "We brought the largest surface combatant in our inventory to conduct the maneuver that smaller vessels have been conducting for years. We brought it because we can. Because the message of presence should be delivered by the vessel that makes presence most apparent." The response was not tactical. It was physical equivalence. The fire control radar was already tracking. The CIWS was already following. The Seahawk was documenting. The Channel 16 broadcast had named everything in the record. Nothing he could add in the next 7 minutes would change the fundamental geometry. A 9,200-ton destroyer was going to hold its position, while a 12,500-ton cruiser passed at 150 yards. He said nothing. CPA to Kilo 1, 140 yards. Time, 6 minutes. At 8:57 a.m., the Renhai's fire control radar activated in tracking mode on the U.S. destroyer. The EW operator reported it. Bridge, CIC. Kilo 1 has activated its Type 346B phased array radar in tracking mode. I'm reading fire control emission consistent with Type 055 fire control radar. They are tracking us. The Type 346B. The Renhai's fire control radar, more capable than any previous adversary fire control system that had tracked the destroyer in any prior encounter. Both vessels now had fire control tracking solutions on each other. Neither had weapons in employment posture. Both were receiving each other's fire control emissions. The South China Sea at 8:57 a.m. had 2 surface warships at 2.8 nautical miles on a closing track, tracking each other with fire control radar, neither in a weapons employment posture. That was the moment. The captain acknowledged the EW report. He did not authorize any additional response measure. The existing posture, fire control tracking, CIWS passive tracking, Seahawk at 400 feet Channel 16 record, was the posture. The Renhai's activation of its own fire control tracking was a response to the situation that was already established. Responding to the Renhai's fire control activation with an additional escalation step would create an escalation spiral in the encounter record that served neither party's interest. The fire control reciprocity was the tactical fact. Both parties were tracking. Neither was engaging weapons. That was the record. CPA to Kilo 1, 130 yards. Time, 5 minutes. The helmsman was 24 years old. He had held course 270 since the watch began. His standing order was course 270. At 130 yards, projected CPA from a vessel that was visible through the forward bridge windows is a large gray shape with 12,500 tons behind it. His standing order was still course 270. His hands were at 10 and 2. His hands were at 10 and 2 at 130 yards from 12,500 tons of People's Liberation Army Navy. The course stayed 270. The tell appeared at 9 a.m. The Renhai reduced speed from 18 knots to 14. Visible on the radar display as a change in the rate of bearing update, the Renhai was covering less distance per radar sweep. The CPA projection shifted outward from 130 yards to 155 yards as the speed reduction changed the Renhai's closing rate and therefore its projected position at CPA. The CIC tactical officer reported it in the same neutral professional tone he used for every contact update. Kilo 1 reducing speed, now 14 knots. CPA projection opening, now showing 160 yards, 4 knots. From 18 to 14. The Renhai's commanding officer had seen the fire control radar on his vessel, the CIWS tracking, the Seahawk overhead, the Channel 16 documentation broadcast, the real-time feed to 7th Fleet. He had activated his own fire control tracking in return, and he had reduced speed by 4 knots. The tell was the speed reduction, not a course change. The Renhai maintained its heading, not a Channel 16 acknowledgement, not a dramatic maneuver. 4 knots, visible across 2 radar sweeps, followed by the CPA projection opening from 130 to 160 yards. The captain noted it. He said nothing. CPA to Kilo 1, 160 yards and holding. Time, 4 minutes. At 9:02 a.m., the Renhai reached its CPA, 162 yards. Not the 250 yards that the original projection had shown, not the 130 yards that the closing track had briefly projected after speed reduction, but 162 yards, the closest the 2 vessels had been. From the Seahawk's aerial perspective at 400 feet, the 2 warships were clearly visible at close range. The Renhai's 180-meter hull passing the destroyer's 155-meter hull at 162 yards separation, the Renhai's superstructure higher than the destroyer's, the size differential that the intelligence brief had described now visible in the most direct physical way possible, as geometry over open water. The Renhai was larger. That was the fact. The destroyer had held its position at 162 yards from the fact. That was also the fact. The blink came in 3 layers. On the radar display, Renhai speed continuing to decrease from 14 to 12 knots after CPA, consistent with a vessel transitioning from an approach posture to a parallel or withdrawal posture. Then visual, the Renhai's bow angle shifting, not a dramatic course change, but a heading adjustment of approximately 2 degrees north as the CPA passed, moving the Renhai's track slightly away from the destroyer's position. Then EW, the Type 346B fire control radar standby at 9:03 a.m. The Renhai had activated it at 8:57 a.m., 6 minutes before CPA, and secured it 2 minutes after CPA. Mission complete. EW signature. The fire control tracking had been an active demonstration during the approach window and was no longer needed. Kilo 1 reducing speed further, now 12 knots. CPA has passed at 162 yards. Contact is on opening track. Type 346B fire control radar has gone to standby. The captain watched the Renhai's track open on the radar display for approximately 30 seconds. Then he turned to the officer of the deck. Secure fire control radar. CIWS passive surveillance. Seahawk maintain documentation orbit for 12 additional minutes, then recover on my call. He looked at the contact picture. The Renhai at 0.9 nautical miles and opening. The Type 054A frigate, which had repositioned to the port beam observation position, was now also decelerating from 10 knots to 6 knots, transitioning to a holding posture now that the approach had completed. The CCG cutter to the southwest had maintained its original position throughout. The operation was complete. At 9:05 a.m., the Renhai transmitted on Channel 16 for the second time in English only. United States warship, the People's Republic of China, has conducted lawful patrol operations in Chinese sovereign waters. Your freedom of navigation operation is an illegal provocation. China has documented your activities. We reserve all rights to protect Chinese sovereignty and will respond through all appropriate measures. We reserve all rights? All appropriate measures? Both statements were accurate. The captain did not respond. No one on the bridge spoke for a long moment. The helmsman unclenched his hands fractionally from the wheel. He had held course 270 through the Renhai's approach, The fire control radar activation on the Renhai, the Renhai's own fire control activation, the 130-yard projected CPA before the speed reduction, the actual 162-yard CPA, and the withdrawal. His hands were at 10 and 2, and then fractionally less tense at 10 and 2 as the Renhai opened to 1.1 nautical miles. The officer of the deck looked at the radar display. The Renhai at 1.2 nautical miles and opening northeast. The Type 054A frigate at 14 nautical miles, holding. The CCG cutter at 8 nautical miles, stationary. A picture that was returning to its pre-0833 configuration. 3 plan-associated vessels, present and watching, not approaching. He straightened his collar. The captain walked to the chart table. The encounter report would go to 7th Fleet, to Indo-Pacific Command, to Pacific Fleet Intelligence, and to the Office of Naval Intelligence's Planned Surface Combatant Assessment Unit. The Seahawk's aerial footage was the priority intelligence product for 2 reasons. The first, the simultaneous frame showing both vessels at CPA range and the size differential visible from altitude. Second, the documentation of the Renhai's bridge wing camera crew, which confirmed the Chinese side's active encounter documentation posture. Full encounter report to 7th Fleet and Indo-PACOM, Seahawk footage as priority product, specifically the CPA frame showing both vessels simultaneously and the size differential documentation. Fire control radar activation log, both ours and the Renhai's Type 346B activation, with timestamps. All Channel 16 transcripts. Complete contact picture, including Type 054A frigate repositioning timeline. He looked at the chart. Flagged the Type 055 deployment, specifically for planned surface combatant assessment. This is the first documented Renhai approach to a U.S. destroyer at CPA range in the South China Sea Patrol record. He looked at the contact picture. The Renhai at 1.4 nautical miles. Continue the freedom of navigation operation. Good watch. The record assembled here speaks in the language the ocean keeps. One people's liberation. Army-Navy, Type 055 Renhai-class guided missile cruiser. Displacing 12,500 tons, 3,300 tons heavier than the U.S. destroyer, conducted a direct intercept approach in the South China Sea at 8:44 a.m. Supported by 1 Type 054A frigate and 1 CCG cutter in documentation positions. This was the first documented deployment of a Renhai-class cruiser for a close-range freedom of navigation response in the South China Sea Patrol record. CPA at 18 knot approach speed. Original projection, 250 yards. Renhai speed reduction till at 9 a.m. from 18 to 14 knots. CPA at passage, 162 yards. U.S. destroyer fire control radar activated in tracking mode on Renhai. Yes, at 8:48 a.m. CIWS passive tracking, yes, from 8:50 a.m. Renhai Type 346, the fire control radar activated in tracking mode on U.S. destroyer, yes, at 8:57 a.m. Duration, approximately 6 minutes, secured at 9:03 a.m. Seahawk documentation, continuous from 8:51 a.m. through 9:14 a.m. Aerial documentation confirmed size differential between vessels visible from altitude. Renhai bridge wing camera crew documented, yes, at 8:52 a.m. Channel 16, broadcasts from Renhai. 2. Sovereignty claim at 8:48 a.m. Closing broadcast at 9:05 a.m. U.S. Destroyer Channel 16, Response 1. Documentation status and posture broadcast at 8:54 a.m. Type 054, a frigate repositioning to observation bearing, yes, at 8:52 Betatu a.m. No close approach by frigate or CCG cutter. Course alterations by U.S. destroyer, 0. CPA held at 162 yards. Freedom of navigation operation continued. Yes, the mass of a vessel is a physical fact. 12,500 tons displacing the South China Sea at 162 yards produces a specific pressure on the water between the two hulls. The destroyer held its position inside that pressure. The Renhai's bridge crew was looking down at the destroyer's bridge. The destroyer's helmsman was at 10 and 2. The course was 270. The course stayed 270. What the size was supposed to accomplish was not accomplished. The record notes the size. The record also notes the course.